Yeah, good morning everybody. You can see where I like to sit in winter. The frost was out on the grass when I woke up this morning, but the winter sun comes in this little corridor here. This is where I like to sit and even get into my singlet, show off my new tattoos for you. I'm drinking from the Blood River mug today. Lutrafir, 16th of December 1838. There's those wagons we saw. It says "An hot alien de ear." I couldn't even tell you what that really means. Something about God is here or something. Slach van Lutrafir. Slach is a battle.
Who are you talking to?
None of your business. So just a couple of things about the channel. I've almost run out of Boer War monuments. There are a couple more, but they're a long way away. There is one that's sort of within a day trip distance. I'm just going to move this a bit so I can swing around a bit. Yeah, that's better. Okay. Oh. Still suffering from that back injury, but only a little bit stiff now. There's no pain, it's just stiffness. Yeah, so I don't know how many more Boer War monuments I can do. They're not particularly popular, but it doesn't bother me. I like seeing them and doing them. Maybe one day I was thinking, maybe I should take my car across to Tasmania and spend a couple of nights in Tasmania, do some. So maybe that's in the cards. Or even New Zealand. Go and do some Boer War monuments in New Zealand, but I don't know. So I'll have to find other things to show you guys, but I've got plenty of ideas in my head to talk about, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a friend of mine, or my best friend. You're lucky in life if you've had a best friend, and I had one. Let's not put him on a pedestal. In lots of ways he was very different to me. He did lots of stuff that infuriated me, and I'm sure I did the same to him. But we were best mates for a long time, and he took his own life. Have to be careful, I think, with YouTube talking about topics like this, but he took his own life in about, I think about 2006. So there's a couple of stories I remember. And even today, actually, I saw his grandchild on Facebook. His daughter is on Facebook, and she had a baby recently, and Steve's grandchild, you know, he would have loved that kid. He would have loved being a grandfather. He was actually the most optimistic person between our group of friends. He was real optimistic about living a long life. He used to, and I was pessimistic. I was living fast, dying young sort of attitude. He used to say, "I want to grow old with you. I want to sit on the porch in our rocking chairs and we talk about our crazy days and things we did." So, but he didn't take that path. But anyway, so he was from New Zealand. I'll tell you what I know about him before I tell you how I met him. He was from New Zealand, and I can't remember, maybe Auckland. He grew up he was about my age. I grew up in the 60s. His dad was like a mechanic, so there was a lot of working on cars. Steve always worked on cars, bought cars, flipped cars, did them up, sold them, made a profit, made a loss. Stereo systems he liked Holdens, and he liked the old British cars, which was probably what there were a lot of in New Zealand in the time he was growing up and helping his dad. His dad, as I said, was a mechanic. His father wasn't a very nice guy in those days. And I say that because of a couple of stories I remember Steve telling me. Well, the kind side of Steve, I remember him telling me about this guy. I think his name was Rolly. He was a Maori, and he was a kid at school that Steve befriended, and this kid, or Rolly maybe, this kid had nowhere to live, and so Steve brought him home and he hid him under the bed, and he used to eat half his food and put the rest in a napkin and then take it into his bedroom, and Rolly would come out from under the bed and Steve would give him the food, and eventually the mother found out that Steve was harbouring a fugitive, a Maori, and the kid was thrown out. Another story that Steve told me was Steve always seemed to love the army toys, trucks, and as he grew up, he was an avid reader. He loved reading books, and mostly military books, military movies, DVDs. He was really knowledgeable on film. All the old actors, Tyrone Power, John Wayne, and those guys in old war movies. Steve had them all. He loved them. But Steve was telling me he had these army trucks, these toy trucks that was his favourites, and he loved playing with his toy trucks. And he had like a go-kart that he'd come down the driveway, and then he'd lock it up and he'd spin around and go around the corner. And one of these rides on his go-kart, he lost control of it and he ran over a little tree that his father had just planted and broke the tree off at the base. When the father saw what had happened, he grabbed Steve by the back of the neck and dragged him in, and he went to his room, and he got Steve's favourite toys, this army truck, and with a hammer in front of Steve, he smashed it to pieces as retribution for breaking his tree. So that tells you a bit about the guy. There was another incident Steve told me. Steve had a grandfather that he absolutely idolised. The grandfather had won a Burma Star. His father fought in the Chindits in Burma against the Japanese. They were like the SAS, fighting behind the lines in the jungles and ambushing Japanese patrols and sort of thing. But he idolised his grandfather. I met the old guy on one occasion. I think he'd had a stroke or something. He could hardly talk. But Steve said when he was young, talking like 5 or 6, the grandfather came on a ship to New Zealand. They actually had a background in South Africa and Rhodesia. So that was another thing Steve and I had in common, was this background to Rhodesia. But the grandfather and the grandmother came on this luxury cruise, and they stopped in at the port in New Zealand, and Steve and his father and family went to see the grandfather on the ship, and the grandfather picked Steve up and held him over the edge of this huge ocean liner. Yeah, you can imagine how terrifying that was. So those were the things that I remember him telling me about his childhood, which kind of give a snapshot of the guy that he developed into now. He was a very independent sort of guy, he grew up real early. So when he was about 14, in New Zealand, the Jehovah's Witnesses came to his house, and his family fell in with them. His mother and father became real devout, church-going Jehovah's Witnesses, and he had a sister. He has a sister, an older sister, and they were just polar opposites, the sister and Steve. The sister went along with it and started going to church, whereas Steve was rebellious. And even at 14, like he wasn't going to go along with that. So there was a lot of conflict, especially with the father, about Steve and going to church. And I guess Steve was pinching the car, driving around without a license. He never worried too much about the law. And anyway, at like the age of 16 or something, he left New Zealand and he came to Australia. Maybe his sister was here before, or maybe they had come to Australia before he had, but at any rate, he was living on his own in Brisbane, in Queensland, when I met him. And he was about 16 or 17. He was working in a factory out the back in the storeroom. one of the things that had happened was he was stacking furniture one time. There were these like tables that had these legs that were like a tri-legged table or something, and he fell, and one of the legs of this table went into his arm, which gave him a huge scar for the rest of his life. He used to say that he'd been bitten by a shark. He used to do a bit of surfing, yeah. So this is how I met him. So I've mentioned probably in the videos, but I'll just remind you again. So I came back to Australia in '76 in January, and then in about June or July of '77 my brother returned, and he stayed with my sister and I and family and that for about a month. And he got a flat in Murrumbina, and I was in Murrumbina recently. If you saw that episode where I picked up my friend Christina and we went to see the monument in Moorabbin, yeah, that was Murrumbina. So my brother had a little flat there, and he didn't have a job, he didn't have any friends. He was just trying to find his feet back in Australia. He'd been away for 6 years or something. When the Jehovah's Witnesses came knocking on his door on a Sunday, and he had some exposure to them in Rhodesia. He'd started dating this coloured girl. She was gorgeous. She was like a model, but she was a Jehovah's Witness. So Aidan, my brother, had some exposure to them. So he let them in, and they got talking, and they ended up taking him to church and all that. And so they started picking him up every Sunday, and for a while we lost him. Like, that's all they could talk about. But anyway, this story isn't about him. But he went to a wedding, Kingdom Hall they call their churches, and so Aidan, my brother, went along to this wedding, and I don't think my brother was sort of full on into it as much as some of them were. I mean, at their weddings they don't have alcohol, they don't have rock music. I don't know. Well, he didn't. But anyway, he was at this wedding, so I think my brother was feeling a little bit isolated from the rest of them. So he looked over and he saw this guy had massive curly hair and was looking equally uneasy, and it was Steve, the guy we're talking about. So Steve was there. He'd come down from Brisbane for his sister's wedding, and he was there, and he was sort of looking around for a beer, and it was hard to get a beer. You had to stand in the corner, and maybe you were frowned upon a bit, I don't know. But my brother was talking to him, and so it was towards the end of '78. I was finishing high school, and my brother said, well, do you want to come on this holiday? At the end of the year, after school, we'll get in my car. And he says, I met this guy that lives in Brisbane, and he said that we're welcome to stay with him. And I said, yeah, okay, that sounds good. So my brother had this little like Toyota Corolla. You could see the road through the floorboards of the passenger side where I sat. I didn't have a license, and my brother did all the driving. And we went up through Sydney and made our way up to Brisbane in this little car. It was a hell of a drive. Nothing really happened. It was a pretty average holiday, to be honest. There were some people that my brother had met through the church that we kept popping in on along the way, I think. But so we get to Brisbane, and we got to the house where Steve lived, and he was still at work. So this is what I remember, and it was like yesterday. I remember it. So we're waiting for him to finish work when we hear this, and this car fishtails around the corner, and he drove that way for the rest of his life. This big Holden fishtails around the corner, and he comes like that, locks up the brakes. There's tyre smoke and engine noise, and he turns on, he jumps out, and out jumped this girl, tanned Queenslander girl, all brown, short skirt. And out jumped Steve, and he ran up and he gave my brother's big bear hug, and then I got the same treatment. And that was Steve to a T. He was very affectionate, he was very loving, he absolutely loved people. He loved meeting people and making new friends. And so he welcomed us, and I thought he was, because he just knocked off work, he picked up this girl, she was living with him at the time. I thought he was, 20 or something. I didn't realise he was about 6 months younger than I was, and he was driving around on a learner's permit. So, I don't know how long we stayed there, but I remember he went to work the next day, and my brother and I were mucking around in the backyard playing cricket with this golf ball. And I hit this fine cover drive straight through the glass panel on the back door of Steve's place, and I felt that bad about it, so I got the phone book and I rang up a glazier or something. The guy came out and replaced the panel, and we went shopping, and I bought Steve this Queen t-shirt, that emblem that Queen have with the swan and the logo and all that. I got that for him, and when he got home from work, he was amazed that someone had bothered to pay money to fix the place. He says, "You shouldn't have worried about it, who cares? It's only a rental." But he loved the Queen t-shirt. He was a big Queen fan. And so we drove back to Melbourne, said goodbyes to him, and I didn't think about him for a while. So at the end of that year, I moved in with my brother into a place called McKinnon, and we were on top of a shop in McKinnon, just a tiny little shopping strip, and just casually one night, so it was probably about 6 months later, I think it was about June, because it was winter in '79. I didn't stay with my brother very long, it didn't work out, but anyway, I was with my brother when he casually said, "Oh, that guy from Brisbane, you remember him? He's just up the road there." I said, "What, Steve?" He says, "Yeah, he's up the road and staying with his parents. They live on McKinnon Road." I go, "Oh, yeah." I mean, I liked Steve off the bat.
I see the Mad Maori over in the corner having a chuckle. Let's go over and have a word.
Speaking of the mic,
Where?
I'm playing with you next. Because Naji is not going to win. So when we sing it,
Maori, pleased to have you over from Auckland today.
60,000 sheep can't be wrong.
You'll go.
Do you know there's two other things that they can use to shoot?
Anyway, always lovely to see you.
In the corner. You got me calling mate.
So he says, "You want to go and see him?" I said, "Yeah, let's go up and see him." So we walked up the road. I'll never forget this either. And so his parents answered the door, and we said, "Is Steve home?" They said, "Yeah, he's in his bedroom." So we went into his room, and he looked like the loneliest puppy in the dog's home. He was sat on the bed. He had like a bucket of red roasted chicken. He had his TV on, and the way his face lit up when he saw us, the joy that he got that someone had come to adopt him, I'll never forget. And that's how I reacquainted with him. So I said to him something like, "We're going to a party this weekend. Do you want to come along with it?" And he said, and first thing he said, yeah, well, I'll drive. Well, I didn't have a license, so I hadn't gone through that at that stage. So that worked out well. So he says, "So I'll pick you up or something." So I said, "Okay." So we got to pick up these girls from that I knew. I was working in a supermarket. There was a couple of girls that we were going to take to this party. So what Steve did was he took out the back seat of this. He had like a Holden HR that had big fat wheels on it and sports steering wheel. He used to cut the springs on the cars to lower them. He'd put on air horns. You know, the car was just, if he got pulled over by the police, they just tore it to shreds for these illegal modifications, but it never stopped him. And always a honking huge stereo that you heard from blocks away. So he turned up to pick us up to take these girls and meet at this party, and he'd taken the back seat out of the car and put a mattress in there with the intention, you know, to bed these women. Well, we were pulled over by the cops on the way to the party, just next to Caulfield Racecourse. And that's when I realised he was driving around on L plates. So he couldn't drive. Actually, maybe I had my P plates, but didn't have a car, because I think I ended up driving the car. The police let me drive it because I think I had a licence but no car. Maybe something like that. So that's when I realised his scant regard for the law and rules of society. So at that stage, I think he was trying to find his place. And if you went through his records in those days, his LPs, like he had Billy Joel, he had Wings Over America, I remember. His musical taste was kind of vanilla, I suppose. You're still trying to find his identity. And I introduced him to this friend of mine that played in a heavy metal band. And this friend of mine, Simon, had taken me to see Thin Lizzy, and we were into metal in our teens. And Steve suddenly found his niche, was heavy metal. And for the rest of his life, he was a metal guy. And the sound of, you know, Crocus or Rammstein in his car was legendary. So the next thing I remember is going to pick him up one Saturday. This is where we really bonded, I think. So I went over to see him on a Saturday. It might have been the week after that party, and I said, let's go for a beer. I must have been 18. Well, we both were, to get in the McKinnon Hotel, but we were a real young 18. So I picked him up at his place. As I said, he just lived up the road from where my brother was, and it was about a 5-minute walk to the McKinnon Hotel on the corner. And if I'm ever in Melbourne again, I might go to that McKinnon and stand outside that bar where we went that time. And we went in as young, as I said, 18-year-olds, and we started ordering drinks. And we got progressively freaking hammered, absolutely hammered, to the state where I was ordering cigars. We were falling off the bar stools and talking crap, and the barmaid was saying, I'm not serving you anymore. You're drunk. And me and him staggered, you know. I remember walking along the fence line. It had, next to the pub was this parking lot that had this fence, and we were clinging to, trying to hold ourselves up. We were kind of crawling to get back to his place. So when I got back to his place, I was a little more sober than him for some reason. Oh, I still drove, yeah. And but he was maggoted. So we put it, I remember him getting into the bathtub with a pillow. His parents must have been away, and he got in the bath for a snooze, and I said, well, I've got to go and collect these guys. I said, we'll come back later. And he said, oh yeah, right, great, I'll be here. So I went and collected these guys. There was Rick and Boot and various mates of ours at the time. I remember we bought this Buddha stick. This is how naive we were. So a Buddha stick, you don't see them anymore. They were imported into Australia, I guess, from Thailand or Asia. So what it was almost like a satay stick, right? And it had real heavy, the heads of a dope plant wrapped with twine. Real powerful, you know, dope. And so we were so naive that we went back to Steve's place, remember, and we were trying to smoke this thing, but we didn't know that you had to break it off and crumble it down, mix it with something, put it in a bomb. But we must have made some headway with it, because we were smoking something and we were that stoned. Actually, I had HR by then. So one of us went out to the car, a guy called Mick. He was younger than us. He was always wanting to drive my car. But he went out to the car and the door locked behind him. So when he came back, he banged on the front door. There were half a dozen of us stoned teenagers. Someone said police, and we all went running through the house, knocking things over. We went flying into the backyard, climbing up the fence, and jumping the fence, running in all directions till we realised it was Mick who was at the front door knocking. So those are some of how it began, me and Steve. So yeah, I had the HR. I needed a car. I started off with a little Morris 1500, like a little station wagon, but I didn't put oil in it. It was always leaking oil, and I got sick of putting oil in it, and of course the head blew one time. And so Steve sold me this HR Holden, which was a typical Steve mobile. That was the one he'd taken the back seat out of, and real loud with a twin exhaust system. And yeah, that's what I was driving around then. So he became part of the crew. So the people I was hanging around with then were kids I'd gone to school with. I started working in IT in '79. So there were a few people from work. I had a girlfriend early on, whereas he didn't, and I know that really affected him. He wasn't a guy that could be alone. He had to have girlfriends all the time to make him feel whole, which, as we'll come to understand, was his insecurity. He craved love and acceptance. So yeah, we were hanging around for a while. We were like those guys from Happy Days. There was half a dozen guys, half a dozen girls. We all hung out every weekend. We went to the movies, we went and saw bands. Sometimes we'd go up to the snowfields. I mentioned in one of the videos Mansfield, where we stayed in the Mansfield Hotel. We'd hire skis. Sometimes we'd go hire horses. We'd go horse riding on a weekend. We might go down to, we used to love it, down Port Campbell, the Great Ocean Road. Yeah, carloads of teenagers. I mean, we were terribly dangerous. We were by no means well-balanced, adjusted teenagers. We took a lot of risks. I remember driving on a two-lane road, passing beers between moving cars. But that's how we were, you know. And some of us stayed longer in that mindset than others, Steve being one of them. But yeah, so he hung around with us, but he was very put out because he didn't have a girlfriend and we did. So and then one time he turns up at this party with this, well, she was a woman. So we were hanging around with girls and he turned up with this woman. She played in a band, her name was Jet, and she had all leather. She was amazing. She had leather pants on, a fur coat, and she played in a band, and she was mature and older than us, and we thought, wow, Steve, where did you find this one? She was a friend of the bass player from Skyhooks, the guy that wrote all those Skyhooks songs. Jet was friends with. So, so another factor with him was his ability to move house. This guy moved house like every couple of months, and he moved in with Jet, and went and saw him a couple of times there, but he'd get sick of them. This is the other thing with him. He would get sick of the women in his life. I mean, for him, it was to be in a relationship with him was the whole ambition of his existence, it seems. Making people love him seemed to be his driving force. Now, you know, if he was in a pub or something, yeah, he was amazing at talking to women. He would go up to anyone, he could talk to them, he could tell you a joke. He was like a big, bubbly, bouncy sheepdog, massive hair. And yeah, that was his thing, picking up women. But then he'd get bored with them and get rid of them. So yeah, he was with this jet for a while, and then I remember he decided that he wanted out, and I was living in this tiny little half house opposite my sister's, talking about 1980. And what he did was he just waited for her to go to work, and then he got a van and he got all his stuff moved out and left her a note and moved in with me. I remember her ringing me saying, you know, do you know where he is? And he's sitting next to me going, you know, and I'm saying, no, I have no idea. How could he have done such a thing? Yeah, he could be uncaring like that. But as I said, yeah, he was about 20. So he lived with me for a while, but here's another thing about him. He had a real competitive nature about him. Everything seemed to be in competition with me, so it was always how many women had he been to bed with, rubbing it in with me. There was a girl that I went out with, and she was very naive, I was very naive. We never had sex, we were too young. And he met her later on, and he was rubbing it in how he'd had sex with her and rubbing it in my face, you know. And here's something I remember. So yeah, as I said, I started going out with this girl. I went out with her for a few years. It was pretty good. But we were at this half house one time, and me and her were in the bedroom. We were just exploratory young people. We had no ideas about or anything I knew about sex. I'd learned from porn sites. So anyway, me and her were in the room mucking around. We heard him in the hallway crying and sobbing, and she says, maybe we should go out and see Steve. I said, he just wants attention, because we're together and he's got no one, so he just wants attention. So we heard him clicking this gun, or loading this gun, and the next minute I hear boom in the hallway. And we went out, and he was sat with his head between his knees. I thought his head had come off, it was gone. Premonition of, 20 years down the track. And yeah, a big hole in my ceiling like that. And he was sitting there sobbing and crying. So my girl sat down with him, put her arm around him, and he was crying because this girl had broken up with him. It might have even been the girl that he was rubbing in my face about. So that tells us his nature. Now later on, his sister actually told me that that wasn't the first time he'd attempted to take his own life. So over the years, saw the guy have many, many girlfriends, but far more cars. Yeah, as I said, he loved doing up Holdens. They were always Holdens. He used to love getting the trading post, going through looking for old cars in the trading post, EHs, and what he could do with them, with like curtains and mattresses in the back, and a bar or a TV, velvet, plush velvet in the back of these vans he'd buy, or an old English car he liked as well. But yeah, over the years, me and him, we were like inseparable. So sometimes I could be the funny one, and he could be the straight one.
Mad Maori, Steve, how are you? Nice to see you up this time of the day, and we don't normally see you.